Playing from Synthesis 20.
Students, this is a continuation of the last class, and I will be finishing off with the issue of race here, and following the next class with the discussion of the ending of the novel, which is very much intrinsically related to the issue of race, as you shall see, because it is the ending of the novel which actually makes us derive a certain conclusion of the stance that the author makes, and also the stance that the novel eventually makes for itself. So most view Twain's depiction of Jim, that I have dealt with in detail in the last class and also supplied you with materials thereof. So according to that perspective, according to that depiction of Jim by Twain, most view that depiction as an ironic attempt to transcend the very prejudices, to go beyond the very prejudices that many people accuse him of perpetuating. His depiction of Jim, Twain's depiction of Jim, is seen by many as an ironic attempt to transcend the very prejudices that Twain himself had been said to have, and the significance that Twain's audience has attached to the journey down the river, that is Jim's pursuit of freedom and Huck's gradual recognition of the slave's humanness or humanity. The significance that people have attached, the readers have attached to the journey down the river of Mississippi is rendered meaningless by the entrance of Tom Sawyer and Tom Sawyer's and Tom's machinations to quote unquote free Jim. That is the ending of the novel, and the particular offensiveness to blacks of the closing sequence of Huckleberry Finn of the novel. It results in part from the expectations that Twain himself has built up during the journey on the raft over the Mississippi. As the two runaway drift towards Mississippi, Huck, along with the reader, watches Jim emerge as a man whose sense of dignity and self-respect dwarf the minstrel mask. It makes the minstrel mask according to which Jim had been drawn so far. And as we move towards Mississippi, towards south of America, towards more and more south of the country, of the continent, on the river of Mississippi, drifting on the raft over Mississippi, the mask with which the stereotypical character of Jim, which had been hitherto drawn, that wears off, that comes off, along with the mask that Huck wears over his eyes, to stop him to see the real humanity, the real identity of the slave, of the black slave. No one can deny the manly indignation evinced by Jim, shown by Jim, when Huck attempts to convince him that he has only dreamed their separation during the night of the heavy fog. Huck himself is so struck by Jim's passion that he humbles himself to a nigger and wasn't even sorry for it afterwards. He was not even sorry to have humbled himself to a nigger. It is from this point onwards that the multidimensionality of Jim's personality, the fact that Jim is not that stereotypical scrawny black slave, ever understanding and ever complacent figure, the fact that Jim has a consciousness of his own which will react variedly to the varied situations of life. It is from this point, it is towards the ending onwards, that this multidimensionality of Jim's personality strikes Huck, and at the same time erodes Huck's own social attitudes towards the blacks. During the night, thinking that Huck is asleep, Jim vents the adult frustrations. He does not expect Huck to understand or to remove, or to even attempt to remove. He laments having to abandon his wife and 2 children. I'll just quote from the chapter. So he laments having to abandon his wife and 2 children and berates himself for having struck his 4-year-old daughter Elizabeth in punishment for what he thought was blatant disobedience. Jim tells Huck of his remorse after discovering that the toddler had gone deaf even without his knowledge. Through such poignant moments, Huck learns to his surprise that Jim cared just as much for his people as white folks for their'n. It don't seem natural, but I beckon it so. Finally, the welcome absence of Pap, drunken father of Huck. In the welcome absence of Pap, Jim becomes a surrogate father to Huck, allowing the boy to sleep when he should stand watch on the raft, giving him the affection his natural father should have but did not, and making sure that the raft is looked after, that the raft is stocked and hidden. Thus, Twain allows Jim to blossom. Thus, Twain allows Jim to blossom into a mature, complex human being whom Huck admires and respects. The fullness of character with which Twain imbues Jim compels Huck to decide forever betwixt 2 things. The reader applauds Huck's acceptance of damnation for helping Jim and affixes all expectations for the rest of the novel to this climactic moment. But sadly, having thus tantalized the readers with the prospect of a harmonious relation between Huck and Jim, representing a harmonious relationship between white and black, Twain seems to turn on his characters and audience. He turns on his characters and as well as his audience. And a critic goes on to say that this is a moral lapse or a lapse in the moral vision of the writer. We will be dealing with this essay in a bit more detail later on. Readers' discomfort with the evasion, with the great escape sequence results from discrepancies between the Jim and the Huck who grow in stature on the raft. Jim and Huck who grow in stature on the raft, and the impostors who submit to Tom. And Fritz Eichleger thus writes that the shift in tone from one of high seriousness to one of low burlesque is to adopt to the almost chilling. Clemens has simply made the issues too serious for us to accept a return to a boyhood world of the novel's opening. Of course, we are asked to forget Huck's process of moral education, his growing awareness of Jim's value as a human being. Similarly, we are asked to forget Jim's nobility revealed to us repeatedly in Escape Down the River. Instead, Jim's become again the stereotyped minstrel show nigger of the novel's first section, a figure to be manipulated, tricked, and ridiculed by the boys. Now, this is important to have done so that we could have returned to the novel of innocent adolescence with which the book begins, which the book is supposed to portray. Twain realizes towards the end of the novel that this has become too serious. Humor as his option or humor as his choice has to be returned back to. By this view, then, Twain's apparent abandonment of Huck's reformation and Jim's quest for freedom constitutes an absolute betrayal. Consequently, many redemptive racial attitudes that Twain has displayed earlier are nullified completely. His final portrait of Jim appears sinister and malicious. Many scholars have attempted to read the evasion sequence in ways that would make it palatable, that would make him, more acceptable, by placing it in sync with the preceding chapters. Twain does not, as most believe, lose courage and fail to carry through with his indictment of the racial attitudes of the Old South. On the contrary, The closing sequence returns the novel and Huck to Twain's true central meaning. For 31 chapters, Twain wages an attack upon conscience, not upon Southern conscience as we want to believe, but upon any conscience. And according to a critic called James M. Cox, whose essay also I will be dealing with later on, the deep wish which Huckleberry Finn, the novel, embodies is the wish for freedom from any conscience. Huck flees conscience at every turn, making choices based on what is most comfortable. It is this adherence to the pleasure principle that defines Huck's identity and governs his actions towards Jim. Not a racial enlightenment as we did hope. The moment at which Huck forsakes the pleasure principles and of which we most approve marks the point at which his identity and Twain's central focus are in the most jeopardy. Cox says, in the very act of choosing to go to hell, he has surrendered to the notion of the principle of right and wrong. Of course, he has chosen a moral stance, he has chosen a principally right option. He has forsaken the world of pleasure then to make a moral choice. Precisely here is where Huck is about to negate himself, where with an act of positive virtue, he actually commits himself to play the role of Tom Sawyer, which he has to assume in the closing section of the book. Insofar as the concluding section brings Huck back into the line with Twain's determination to subvert all points, all forms of conscience, it remains consistent with the preceding chapters. Given this, to declare Twain's ending a failure is to deny his actual thematic intent and to increase our discomfort with the concluding segments. Cox's argument demonstrates the length to which some scholars go and take if they want to feel comfortable with the final chapters of Huck Finn. But this is not a very authentic or legitimate black perspective, because the inadequacy of these scholarships challenges to the novel and other challenges to the novel becomes clear when one considers the issue remains hot enough and open enough for interpretation. Others who concentrate on the actual matter or actually what happens in the closing chapters. Regardless of Twain's motivation or intent, Jim does deflate himself and climb back into that minstrel costume. His self-respect and manly pursuit of freedom bow down subserviently before the childish pranks of an adolescent white boy. And considering the perplexity of the evasion brings us back full circle to Huckleberry Finn's suitability for public schools, given the powerlessness of highly discerning readers to resolve the novel in a way that unambiguously redeems Jim or Huck, how can students be expected to fare better with the novel's conclusion? The novel becomes more perplexing, confusing, and entangled when we move from the context into which we want to study Huckleberry Finn and consider the nature of the text and its creator. Though many love to praise Huckleberry Finn as a savage indictment of a society that accepted slavery as an institution, as a way of life, the truth is that neither the novel nor its author has escaped ambivalence about racial matters. First, the ambiguities of the novel are multiple. The characterization of Jim is a string of inconsistencies. At one point, he is the superstitious darky. At another, he is the indulgent surrogate father. On the other hand, his desire for freedom is unconquerable, and on the other, he submits to the ridiculous antics of a child. Further, while Jim flees from the slavery and plots to steal his family out of bondage, most other slaves in the novel embody the romantic contentment with the peculiar institutions that slaveholders tried to convince abolitionists all slaves felt. The vocal attitude towards the black, it firstly brings into question the ambivalence and the split in the nature of the self that I was talking about in the last class regards Homi K. Bhabha's essay Mimicry and Man, which you must read in order to understand this concept of ambivalence more closely. So Twain's equivocal attitude towards blacks extends beyond his fiction into his lifelong struggle with the Negro question. In his autobiography, Twain himself describes the complacence with which he accepted slavery while growing up. Leaving the slaveholding misery seems to have had little effect on the racial outlook, because in 1853 he wrote home to his mother in New York that I reckon I had better black my face, for in these eastern states niggers are considerably better than white people. He served briefly as a Confederate soldier before heading west and never seemed to be morally discomfited with the defense of slavery. Set over and against these unflattering details are Twain's advocacies for equality. And in 1985, a letter proving that Twain had provided financial assistance to a black student at the Yale University Law School in 1885 was discovered and authenticated by Shelley Fisher Fishkin. Again, one of the names or one of the essays by Shelley Fisher Fishkin, which we will be reading together. And in the letter, Twain writes, "We whites have the ground the manhood out of them, and the shame is ours, not theirs, and we should pay for it." He is also known to have teamed with Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was a leading political figure of the former slave associations, of the former slaves. He was a black American and he was a successful political figure. So Twain was also known to have teamed with Booker T. Washington in championing several black causes. The factor of racial uncertainty on the part of Twain, its manifestation in his best loved piece, that is the novel, and its existence in American society should not be a barrier to Huckleberry Finn's admittance into the academic curricula. Instead, they should make it a pith, a hub of the American literature curriculum. The insolubility of the race question as regards Huckleberry Finn functions as a model of the fundamental racial ambiguity that characterizes the American mindset. This ambivalence is very much intricately linked to the choice of narrative voice in the novel, and the choice of language, that is the vernacular in which Huckleberry Finn talks. 20th century American criticism abounds in pronouncements about how Twain's choice of a vernacular narrator in Huckleberry Finn transformed modern American literature. And Lionel Trilling writes, in an essay called "The Greatness of Huckleberry Finn," that the prose of Huckleberry Finn established for written prose the virtues of American colloquial speech. It has something to do with ease and freedom in the use of language. Most of all, it has to do with the structure of the sentence, which is simple, direct, and fluent, maintaining the rhythm of the word groups of speech and the intonations of speaking voice. Twain is the master of the style that escapes the fixity of the printed page, that sounds in our ears with the immediacy of the heard voice. And as another critic had noted, that today it is the standard academic wisdom that Twain's central precedent-setting achievement is Huck's language. Before Twain wrote Huckleberry Finn, no American author had entrusted his narrative to a voice of a simple, uneducated, untutored vernacular speaker, or for that matter to a child. Albert Stone notes in his book, the name of which I'll be writing on the screen. Yes. So Albert Stone is saying in his book, The Innocent Eye, Childhood in Mark Twain's Imagination, that the vernacular language in Huckleberry Finn in the novel strikes the ear with the freshness of a real boy talking out loud. Could the voice, now the question is that could the voice of an actual boy reading out or talking out loud have helped Twain recognize the potential of such a voice to hold an audience's attention and to win its trust? Twain himself noted in his autobiography that he based Huck Finn on Tom Blankmanship, the poor white son of a local drunkard whose pariah status, an exemption from school, church, etc., made him the envy of every respectable boy in Hannibal. And what demands our notice in the passage that I have quoted from his autobiography is that although Tom Blankmanship may have been the model for Huck's place in society, Twain never suggested that there was anything memorable about the nature of his talk. Huck's talk, on the other hand, as many critics have noted, is the most memorable thing about him. And there is another voice which speaks through the veil of the voice that Twain chooses or Huck renders in the manifestation of what Twain wants. And so on November 29th, 1874, 2 years before publishing Tom Sawyer or before Twain began to write Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain published an article called Sociable Jimmy. Sociable Jimmy takes the place of Honor as the first piece Twain published that is dominated by the voice of a child. And this fact alone would seem to mark it as deserving of our attention. In this article, Twain says that he originally sent the sketch of Jimmy home in a letter in the days when he was a public lecturer. And although this initial letter has disappeared, subsequent letters Twain wrote home to his wife allow us to determine that the encounter he relates happened in the late 19th century, 1871 or 72. Twain reports that he had supper in his room, and as was his habit, and that a bright, simple, guileless little darky boy, 10 years old, wide-eyed, observant little chap, was sent to wait on him. The intensity of Twain's response to a child is striking. He notes that he wrote down what the child said and sent this record home because he writes, yes, because he wished to preserve the memory of the most artless, sociable, and exhaustless talker I have ever come across. Twain's revelation involved in his recognition of the potential of a bright, simple, guileless, wide-eyed, observant child as narrator is the voice of Jimmy. Is the voice which is something that Twain had never come across before, and therefore became a model for the voice with which Twain would change the shape of American literature. That Twain contained within himself a language and a set of cadences and rhythms he could generate fluently on his own, having been exposed to many such voices in his youth. Jimmy triggered his recollection of those voices and sparked his appreciation of the creative possibilities that they entailed. And the remarkable impression that Jimmy made upon Twain can be viewed as connected to Twain's awareness of the ease with which he could speak in that dialect himself. And therefore he writes that I think it's not one, it's I, it's just a misprint. Let me just correct it, yes. And he writes that I think I could swing my legs over the arms of a chair and that the boy's spirit would descend upon me and enter into me. It was a crucial step on the road to create Huck. In the explanatory chapter before the novel begins, Twain explains 7 dialects used in the book. This is the edition by Walter Blair and Victor Fisher. Twain gives an explanatory. One of the 7 dialects is the Missouri Negro dialect. Now, it has been much debated whether Twain did in fact use 7 dialects or more or fewer, but they have generally assumed that only the Negro dialect in the book is that spoken by African American characters. Only African American characters, for example, say dat, D-A-T, as opposed to that. But phonology does not describe a voice, as many scholarships try to distinguish Huck's voice. Voice involves syntax and diction, the dialect, the cadences, the rhythms of the speaker's sentences, the flow of prose, the structures of the mental processes, the rapport of the audience, the characteristic stance as regards the material related. The cadences and rhythms of Jimmy's speech, his syntax, his diction, his topics of conversation, attitudes, limitations, and his ability to hold our interest and our trust bear a striking resemblance to those qualities of speech and character that we have clearly come to identify with Huck himself. Both the boys are naive and open, engaging and bright. They're unpretentious, uninhibited, easily impressed, and unusually loquacious. They freely associate with remarkable energy and verve, and they are supremely self-confident. Neither doubts for a minute that Twain, in Jimmy's case, or the reader, in Huck's case, is completely absorbed by everything he has to say. We are not at all convinced by everything that Huck says. And it can be said that Twain did blend black voices with the white to create the voice we know as Huck's. One of the key elements that identifies, that is emblematic of Huck's speech patterns, as Richard Brigman notes in his essay called in an essay called it's not a particular essay, it's a chapter in a book written by Richard Bridgman, and a book called Huckleberry Finn. And he notes that one of the characteristics which is emblematic of Huck's language is the element of repetition that we see. And Bridgman comments that repetition reaches a particularly conscious structural function in extended passages where phrases are repeated, such as in chapter 39. Yes, Huck says this. And then again he says, I'll just give a few examples over here. And another passage is there again where he says that that's an awful big church, awful high steeple, and it's all solid stone except just the top part, the steeple. It's going to kill somebody, yet that steeple, a man, big man he was, bigger and what Bill is, tuck it up there and fixed it again. And he didn't look no bigger and a boy, he was so high up, that steeple's awful high. Repetition. And there are several other passages as well. Like this one which I am quoting. Just a moment. Yes. This is from chapter 5 of Huckleberry Finn. And this is from the essay that I just mentioned, Sociable Jimmy, that Twain wrote. See, there are so many similarities that you can find within the two extracts, one from a chapter of Huckleberry Finn and another one from the essay Sociable Jimmy. His speeches, both of their speeches are onomatopoeic. Both of the speeches show Twain's willingness to invest words with new meaning, such as this one. Twain's willingness to introduce new words into the speech. This is from Bridgman's own book. And the effect of these words, Bridgman writes, is they are employed less to build an effect of cumulative nature and more to the effect of immediacy. And they contribute to the gradual accumulating feeling in American literature for the importance of the single word. Critics such as McKay notes that Twain did want to emphasize on the fact that Huck was an illiterate, but it was not to overwhelm the audience. We can also characterize Huck's voice or the use of words or the use of phrases by Huck as an employment of verbal metaphor. He has the capacity to draw an image with his words, such as when he says that like the whole world was asleep, and onomatopoeic phrases such as thunder, rumbling, grumbling, tumbling down the sky. Jimmy also says similar things like all swelled up like a pudding, and onomatopoeic phrases such as the clock booms and the jars so you think the world's coming to an end, and Bob just sloshes round the looms. So colloquial and seemingly unaffected and unrehearsed that we frequently feel as if he is carrying on a conversation with us. It was a real conversation that inspired Huck's voice in the very first place. That is what it implies. So many significant similarities that Twain employs within the voices of both Jimmy and Huck. And they have more in common than their linguistic capability. On the level of cadence, syntax, and diction, or the similarities between the two boys' character traits and topics of conversation, we can also see similarities in them. The adult world remains largely confusing to the two boys, and confusing and cryptic to both Jimmy and Huck, who are blissfully oblivious to the gaps in their understanding. And part of the humor in both the novel and the essay Sociable Jimmy stems from the reader's awareness that sometimes neither Jimmy nor Huck understand that a joke is being perpetrated. Twain finds Jimmy's dense simplicity so engaging that he devotes a bracketed aside in the piece to explicating it, and I'm going to quote that. Sometimes fails to get a joke, as I've quoted a few extracts from the novel. At the circus, for example, the drunk who had argued with the ringmaster until he gave him a chance to ride jumps on the charging horse pulls off his outer clothes and turns out to be on the regular circus performers in disguise. And then Huck says that then the ringmaster, he see how he had fooled and he was the sickest ringmaster you ever see. So Huck has been even able to take even more than he realizes, of course, since he is oblivious to the fact that the ringmaster's embarrassment is part of the circus routine as well. His typical stance is dead earnestness, that you get it in abundance in the novel, particularly in the face of circumstances that would strike most readers as funny. as another person called Walter Blair. Walter Blair, in his book called Mark Twain and Huck Finn, Walter Blair writes that since he was almost completely humorless, he was bound to be incongruously naive and somber on many laugh-provoking occasions. And it is interesting that in the essay Sociable Jimmy, written early in his career, Twain felt that the need to flag the gaps in the child's understanding for the reader. And by Huckleberry Finn, the novel, he would allow that character trait to emerge without any sort of authorial comment. By the time he wrote Huckleberry Finn, Twain had figured out how to use a narrator's naive responses to the world around him to unmask the hypocrisy and pretensions of that world, a strategy with which he had begun to experiment in 1870 and 1871 in Goldsmith's Friend Abroad Again. And although Jimmy's naivete, as conveyed by Twain, serves no satirical purpose, it is completely convincing that totally believable, authentic innocence would be a crucial component of what readers would find compelling about Huck. And both Jim and Huck usually pepper and spice up their conversations with accidents that are bizarre, grim, grisly, and preposterous. In Jimmy's case, it is the cow that had gotten skewered by the church people. I have quoted the extract. And in Huck's case, it was the flattening of Hank Bunker. Now, also, as I was saying something before this, that the naivety of the protagonist or of the narrator, the fact that he is so incomprehensive of the world that he sees around him, and even about Jim, if we speak in the same line of manner, both of these do what I said, that their incomprehensiveness actually lights the gaps and the flaws and the hypocrisies in the so-called well-structured world outside, the conventional world outside. Here again, we can bring in the dialogic theories of Bakhtin, which I had explained in the last class and also given you materials in support of. So the dialogic element of the novel allows for heterogeneity within the novel as a challenge to power thereof. Here again, Huck becomes that radical character, a naive narrator who completely fails to understand the usual ways of looking at the world. Bakhtin uses the word estrangement, that is to make strange. Closest to this, the theoretical concept that is closest to this stands in the Russian formalist school, and the concept being defamiliarization. Bakhtin uses the word estrangement, or to make strange, in order to suggest that what happens in a fixed, conventional way of looking at the world, speaking about the world. And when this conventional way of looking and seeing meets a narrator who is uncomprehendingly naive, who by his very uncomprehending presence makes the strange world of social conventionality, makes this world of social conventionality strange, estranges the social conventional world. That is perhaps what Twain wanted to do. And according to the quotations excerpts that I have quoted on the screen, and according to what another critic called David Sloan in Mark Twain as a literary comedian notes, effortlessly blended into Huck's comments on omens of bad luck, his anecdote disappears in the run of his talk. Jimmy's anecdote slips unobtrusively into his talk as well, Both boys apparently wish to be scrupulously accurate about whether their reports are first or second hand, reinforcing in the process the reader's trust in the candor of both of their narratives. Another thing that both of the narrators or both of these people they have in common is an aversion to violence and cruelty. Both boys have had dreams about cruel and violent acts they have witnessed and have difficulty talking about the subject. Jimmy tells us that he cannot kill a chicken, and after a mindless killings in a feud, Huck says that it has made me sick. I almost fell out of the tree. While Jimmy's comments involve chickens and Huck's involve human beings, the visceral rejection of violence and cruelty in each case is similar, as each child's reluctance to talk about it, and the expression of personal anguish with the barely understood sleep disturbance of a child. When either Jimmy or Huck is truly determined to fascinate his listener, he launches into a song, name-filled family narrative. In neither case is the family his own. Jimmy talks about the family that runs the inn in which he works, and Huck about an invented family designed to make convincing whatever identity he has chosen at that moment. There are other similarities between the characters of Jimmy, the essay that sociable Jimmy, that the essay that Twain had written earlier on his career, and Huck, is that both of them have drunkard fathers. They share some matters of taste. They're especially awed by a particular clock, and set themselves up as judges of refinement. They are both at home with dead animals, dead cats and dead fish. They're simply a part of their world, and they wouldn't dream of omitting them for their chatty conversation. Twain writes in his own autobiography that if simplicity and innocence and unconsciousness are to be desired, who better to embody these traits than a child? Sociable Jimmy was Twain's first published work in which the voice of a child took the center stage. And in the years that immediately followed its publication, Twain became increasingly aware of the distinction between the possibilities of a choice of a child narrator. And as he once put it, in an essay, that experience has taught me long ago that if ever I tell a boy's story, it is never worth printing. To be successful and to be worth printing, the imagined boy would have to tell the story himself and let me act merely as his amanuensis. That was, of course, precisely the role in which Twain placed himself, and copied down that sociable Jimmy's speech that evening. It is the same role that Twain assumed in this imagination when he began writing Huckleberry Finn. And perhaps all this was a way of Twain's recognition and then manifestation of his own realization that there was a great potential that lay in vernacular storytelling. And that is why perhaps Huckleberry Finn is so much easier to read, so much easier to acknowledge, because it is a story that has been told from the perspective of a boy who may have been modeled upon a black slave, a black former slave. And Shelley Fisher Fishkin's essay on this particular choice of vernacular, which I will be sharing with you, you will be getting mostly biographical references and information. But what you will understand after reading it is that it was a conscious choice. And there may be perspectives as to the varied perspectives as to the regarding the ending of the novel. But Twain perhaps did it deliberately, and that is a choice that you have to make.